Okay. Hello, everyone. So I'm currently in Lagos and my connection might cut, so please bear with me. I'm presenting on Disciplining the Night in colonial Lagos between the 1920s and the 1950s. Okay. So this paper explores the night in Lagos as a privileged site in which imaginaries, anxieties, and disciplinary investment converge to the point of criminalization. And I'm arguing that from early colonial ordinances that forced Black African residents to hold torches when out at night, to the arrest of women for prostitution or loitering, for being outside after dusk, to the closing of streets by night watchmen, a plethora of apparatuses have sought to channel and circumscribe the uses of the night in Lagos, reconfiguring each night the geography of the city. I argue more specifically that nighttime itself is criminalized in colonial Lagos, how colonial authorities imagined the night and invested it with a criminal surplus had serious material consequences on every night experiences. And rather than taking as a starting point the intimacy between criminality and nighttime, I explore how such intimacies get produced and shape the meaning of the night itself. So through an exploration of colonial legal texts, police records, and newspapers from the period, I trace the proliferation of terms such as unattached, unescorted, without visible means of livelihood, loitering, unable to give an account of oneself, night walker, wandering, or found without a lamp, and the temporal logic of suspicion that undergirds such terms. So I will start with a brief account of the temporal structures of colonial law and the extent to which they encode and define an imaginary of the night as a site of suspicion and excess. Then I move on to analyze specific instances of criminalization in legal texts. And finally, I end with a brief analysis of a nocturnal encounter with law enforcement. So in this first subsection, I propose an examination of what I call the temporal structures of colonial law. That is, we underexplored ways in which laws encode and define the temporal domain of application. Night scholars and historians of policing have explored how Western forms of policing partly emerged in Europe out of previous forms of night control, such as the night watch and the night walker statutes. Daytime policing only emerged much later in the 19th century. And we can think, for instance, of the 1285 Statute of Winchester in medieval England, which reformed the night watch as giving limitless powers to arrest night walkers from the closure of the city gates from sunset till sunrise. So I'm trying to think through how rituals of gate closure, curfew, and night walker arrest contributed to firmly establish the night as a proper domain of crime in imaginaries. Yet, as Carbentou explores in his analysis of criminal records in France and England, despite being classified differently and punished more severely at night, homicides or theft were not more prominent than in daytime. So the legal text of the Lagos colony evidence the imperial afterlives of such imagination of the night, as the night abounds in this text as an elusive object of legal definition. While navigation law continues to abide by the definition of the night walker statutes, that is the time between sunset and sunrise, other legal sections define it otherwise. The 1923 Criminal Code, for instance, understands the night or nighttime as the interval between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., effectively decoupling its definition from the atmosphere. In contrast, the 1923 Labor Code in Lagos prohibits night labor for women and children, but defines the night as starting at 10 p.m. for women and nightfall for children. The lantern laws, which are another set of laws forbidding people to be out at night without carrying a lamp, and which are usually defined individually by each township, which are a sub-geography of the colonial city, produce yet another layer of geotemporalities at night. So this shifting definition of the night created a patchwork of confused and overlapping temporal sovereignties, Rather than fixing the meaning of the night, they offer a window into a necessarily messier field of practice and contestation. So my argument here has less to do with the definitions themselves than the impulse to define. By legislating what counted and did not count as nighttime, colonial legal codes established the night as part of an essential legal lexicon and the only word in that lexicon which pertained to time. So moving to my second section, I want to make the case that nighttime in the colonies and in Lagos specifically was extensively criminalized in a double sense. Criminalized as context when nighttime constituted an incriminating or aggravating element, or criminalized as object when the crime itself was defined as nocturnal in nature or existing only at night. In both cases, nighttime seemed to invest every gesture with a surplus of suspicion and a kind of criminal excess. So starting with the night criminalized as context, legal texts throughout the colonial period and beyond established a logic of suspicion at night, thereby the threshold for arrest was significantly lower. The 1901 ordinances of the colony of Lagos established that for misdemeanors, such as manufacture of, dealing in, and use of charms, there was a need to prove the intent to commit a felony during the day, while at night, mere possession was enough for an arrest. The charms in question, otherwise known as juju, were said to be used to commit burglary as they prevented people from waking up at night. Both the 1923 and 1948 criminal codes reconfirm a doubling of sentencing in terms of fine, corporal punishment, hard labor, imprisonment for a range of crimes if committed at night. And for instance, wandering is requalified from a simple offense to a misdemeanor, while threatening violence is requalified from a misdemeanor to a felony. This means, in practice, a sentence shifting from 1 to 3 years imprisonment. In some cases, the name of the crime itself changed. Housebreakings turned into burglaries at night and were punished twice as hard. There's the colonial law itself reflecting the belief that it was not merely the intensity or degree of crime that changed with the night, but its very nature. This leads to the night as object rather than mere context of criminalization. That is, when the target of law enforcement of generalized temporal suspicion early on in colonial legislation, as the police ordinance of 1897 establishes the possibility of arrest without a warrant in cases of 1, flagrant délit, 2 reasonable charges brought against by someone else, 3 reasonable doubt, and 4 loitering at night. It means here that mere presence at night was reasonable grounds for arrest in a fashion reminiscent of the night worker statutes. The lantern laws, which can be found throughout the British Empire and which are a quintessential example of such criminalization, are established as a provision of the 1897 police ordinance and enabled in any proclaimed district of the city, the police to arrest without warrant all persons passing after a specific hour without carrying a light. Such persons were liable of a £5 penalty or 14 days imprisonment. Night, but were in practice enacted in patchwork and intricate ways. Inspired by Simon Brown's analysis of lantern laws in New York of the 1700s, I argue that such laws kept the overdetermined Black African body in a state of permanent elimination and produced this body to an extent phenomenologically at night. Finally, a category of criminalization which sits at the crossroads between context and object is the temporalization of otherwise not temporally specific crimes into the night by focusing on the nocturnal occurrences. Here I'm thinking about the close association in colonial authorities' imaginaries between the night and certain practices, such as transactional sex, gambling, drinking, vigilantism, witchcraft, loitering, or even trafficking. And such close association made nighttime a pervasive context of what Sally Engel Mary calls the criminalization of everyday life. By a suggestive displacement, The criminalization of those specific practices often unfolded as a criminalization of the night itself as a spatial temporal frame. And I want to give briefly the example of the legislation against prostitution in the 1940s, which criminalized, instead of the act of solicitation itself, the very presence of women at night. This meant that empowered parapolice and paramilitary organizations, such as the Anti-Vice Squad, took advantage of this as a new avenue of extortion to harass, arrest, and racket so-called unescorted or unattached women in nightclubs, bars, and public spaces. The extent to which this legislation remade the temporal architecture of the city for women have been largely underexplored. So moving away from legislative text, I want in a last part to analyze one example of encounter with law enforcement at night to give a sense of the intricate and layered sovereignties competing in colonial nocturnal Lagos. So here we have an extract of the Ikeda criminal record book for 1934. So I'm just going to read that quote. I caused the bell to be sung that people should not come to my village after 9:30 p.m. The night watchman on duty fires a gun and blows a whistle. 9 days after my house had been burglared, complainant came to my village at 11:30 p.m. I was called with a whistle by the night watchman. I came out at once. I saw complainant and witness. I instructed that they should be tied up. Complainant is an old enemy of mine. I flogged them and let them go. They were well flogged. I'm next in rank to the ballet of Ayubo. I have a right to flog anyone in my own house. I know complainant who has been in Ayubo for some time. So this is Eguyumi, farmer of Ayubo. And I've added then the complainant on a recounting of the encounter, which presents significant differences, especially regarding the time at which that encounter takes place. So this encounter evokes vividly the nocturnal soundscape of policing in colonial Lagos. Geotemporalities were delimited by sounds of whistles and guns in a context in which street lighting was reserved for the European areas. The function of sound was to discipline the edges of the night, both temporal and spatial. As the sound of the whistle moved along the path traveled by the night watchman at the beginning of the curfew and then regularly throughout the night till the morning, it outlined temporal and geographic borders, while by its ephemerality testifying to their fragility. So these sonic signals had a dual logic, dissuading potential criminals, but also proving to residents that the watchmen were not sleeping on the job. During the 1930s, as Lagos was plagued with numerous cases of armed robbery, the pre-colonial night guard institution was revived in spaces left to fend for themselves by colonial authorities, which were mostly the periphery and the rural areas, as can be shown on that map. So there was a bifurcated or even trifurcated control of the night in colonial Lagos, with the white areas in which the Nigerian police force with its night patrols kept a vigilant watch and protected European interests. The so-called native areas in which the Black population resided and was patrolled by native authority policemen with much less efficiency. And finally, the far outskirts of the city, which are in green in this map, which were further marginalized and had to recreate their own night guard organizations. So it's mainly in those areas that you have this phenomenon of night watchmen, but you can find them even in central areas in Lagos.
3 minutes,
those yes, sorry, 3 minutes, okay. Those night watchmen were adding to the operations of task forces, night patrols, further complicating basically the landscape of policing at night in colonial Lagos. This confusion of legal statutes and de facto jurisdictions produced nighttime as a space of constant interpellation, questioning, and potential violence, as a nocturnal presumption of guilt casts suspicion on any night walker. Colonial Lagos was thus, and I argue still is, thoroughly shaped by not one, but multiple overlapping and conflicting curfew cultures, creating layered geotemporalities at night. The shift in the example from my village to in my own house, blurs registers of legitimate authority for night watchmen, but also gives a glimpse of the temporal imagination at play, as nighttime with its curfews and gate closing rituals reveals both a retreat within the confines of the domestic, but also the dramatic expansion of the sovereignty of the and language of the domestic. So to conclude, this brief survey of the complex and multifarious forms of control at night in colonial Lagos gives a sense of the extent to which residents inhabited the night on borrowed time, always in a state of illegitimacy. The ubiquity of a logic of suspicion, often inflected by race, class, gender, and ethnicity, threatened to turn nighttime into a stolen or disappeared temporality. The archives, however, are replete with examples of insistent refusal by individuals who, though knowing the risk, persisted in inhabiting the night for myriad reasons, from necessity to rebellion, passing through the quest for fleeting pleasures in the interstices of the colonial night. Samuel Egbomo, arrested multiple times for wandering at night, sentenced in 1937 to 12 months imprisonment and to receive 12 strokes, leaves the court with this phrase, "I will come back again." Against the grain of the violent terms through which the night enters the colonial archive, what sets of modes of being in the wake, what practices of fugitivity and queer temporalities remain to be critically fabulated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Amazing. So, very amazing. So it's time questions at the end, because it's yeah, maybe questions at the end better, just to manage better the time of this session. Now it's time for Guy. Are you here? Yeah. Hello, your time.
So do I just share the screen and you get the presentation? Yeah. Okay. So let me start with the time-honored way of apologizing. I assume that would be the only lawyer speaking in the conference, and I'm very happy to see that I'm not. So it's already worth it. I was also hoping we'd be in Lisbon while I'm sweating in Tel Aviv, which is less fun than you might think. I'm trying to write a book on night law. I have a chapter which I'd offered to read, and I have this presentation. Honestly, I'd be happy with any information or ideas you might have. I cover a little bit of the ground that Chrystel has covered, so I'll be able to go quickly. And I admit that I've tried to make it a little bit fun. So if it works, it works, and if it doesn't, you know, it's the corona. I also apologize for disappearing over the whole day. Our semester is not over, and our students actually insist that I come to class. So, you know, I do that sometimes. Okay. So when you think about night court, and this shows my age, or night law, some people might think of a lovely old television series about night and law, but most people don't really think of how much law is involved in the night, except in emergency situations, but it's a much deeper and more complex involvement. The way I see it, or the way I try to see it, is first that night being a public policy question, having been, still is, always will be, it raises the necessity of legal regulation, because at the end of the day, what lawyers do is, you know, what policy makers want us to do. And again, most of us think about it, as Chrystel mentioned, in terms of emergency and this sort of enforcement, but it's much more pervasive. So night becomes very quickly a legal issue. And again, the way I think about it, it's a question of the future, the past, and the present. And I'll go very quickly, in 13 minutes, over the future, and then the past and the present. I'm talking about the future because when I talk to people to whom I'm trying to sell this book, I'm trying to tell them this is not just a historical issue, but it's actually going to be very important in public policy in years to come. And again, not just as an emergency measure. So let me give you a few examples, which I think is pretty obvious to people who are in this conference. Okay, so one of them is the issue of how we are actually losing the night. And that's the issue of light pollution, which again, if at some point, it already clearly has economic and health implications, which means eventually it will be regulated. We actually are so far down the path of light pollution that most people who live in urban areas don't have a night, a proper night. And sometimes it has almost a comical effect. For example, during a blackout in '94, people in Los Angeles called 911 because they saw the stars for the first time and they were really afraid. What are we seeing? You know, is it aliens coming to take us? But in a less jovial way, we're actually seeing a world where we might see night tourism. So people are going to travel thousands of miles to see stars. That's one of the reasons why people go hiking. And of course, when they're looking for places to place observatories and such, there are very few places left on Earth where you can do that. The second issue, of course, is sleep. For many years, we've considered sleep, you know, a private issue. You know, if you sleep well, good. If you don't, too bad. But now we have a lot of reason to think that sleep is a public policy issue, is a disease, is dangerous, and has many implications. For example, if the coronavirus showed us that we can work from home, then eventually sleep might push us into working in different time shifts. For example, it is very clear now that we need sleep for lots of health reasons, but we also know that young people, students, would probably be better off if they slept 2 or 3 more hours and actually went to school later, and so on. So these are issues that are going to be regulated. Of course, funny as it may sound, to remind you that we'll spend about 30% of our time sleeping, which is not a small issue. The depressing part is that we now know it's also a socioeconomic issue, because the richer you are, the more time you have to sleep. If you work in 3 different jobs and you have 3 kids and you really need the money, you don't have time to sleep. If you're disturbed, you can't sleep. If you don't have a cold, dark environment to sleep at night, you have trouble sleeping. So again, this becomes a socioeconomic divide where you need to be rich to be able to sleep. It's like buying produce in America or being able to go to the gym. If you are overworked and poor, single mother with kids, then you're unlikely to be able to get good sleep. And again, as usual, it has economic implications. So I would not be surprised to see this becoming an area where public policy experts and then lawyers move in, because wherever there are where is money to be saved, there is money to be gained. And this is how I came across this community, and I've already attended a conference in Groningen a couple of years ago, so I'm very well aware that there is a very big community out there. Again, you guys are part of it, and I realize that as lawyers, we are the periphery. We are actually not part of the mainstream. Sociologists, geographers, architects are in, lawyers are out, which is a little depressing once you realize, I'm too old to become something else. The second issue that I want to talk about comes from history to current issues. And again, history is replete with meaning or practical legal implications of the night, much more dramatic than today, and there is actually quite a bit of it today. So let me give you a few explanations or a few examples, and again, Chrystel, I'm sort of moving into your territory. So 2 issues I want to talk about. I want to start with fire. Until the advent of electricity just 100 years ago, and in some places less than 100 years ago, the only way you could have artificial light at night was fire. Fire was very, very dangerous, causing a lot of fires, especially when houses were constructed of wood. And there's a lot of legal rules in torts and criminal law how to handle fire, which now sound quaint, but for all of history until 100 years ago were very, very important. The second problem was that as artificial light was only fire, that meant we actually lived in the dark. So the night was very, very dark. And this has a lot of implications, some of which I will talk about now. Being out at night was dangerous and mostly illegal in most places. There were mandatory curfews. I'll come to this in a minute. There's a lot of regulation, and this is, Chrystel, where I would sort of widen it. There's a lot of historical regulation who can be outdoors, with a general assumption that anyone who does not have a good reason to be outdoors, like doctors, nurses, police officers, lawmen, and the such. Basically, you're either a law person or you're an outlaw. So it's a very, very clear distinction. You know, prostitutes, people in bars, ill repute, or you are a person of the law, medical profession, and the like. I apologize for using this for prostitute, but I was trying to be funny. I now realize I was culturally insensitive, and I apologize. Okay, or maybe not. There's a lot of regulation of what can be done indoors. You are supposed to sleep, or you can basically eat, pray, and love indoors. That is, you know, eat, pray to God, and have children. But that's basically what you're supposed to do at home. Fire was very dramatic. There's a lot of evidence about how most major cities in the world, well into the 20th century, were formed and reformed by fire. This has a lot of implications for modernity, because part of the question why we don't have old cities in Europe is not just because of World War II, it's because they have been repeatedly lit, they've been repeatedly ravaged by fire over history. And the result has been a lot of legal regulation, most famously Fire Prevention of the Metropolis Act, but there's a lot of regulation from the Great Fire of 1666 on how to build, where to build, what structures to use, what materials to use, etc. So there's a lot of legal implications for fires alone. And again, many cities around the world have been ravaged by fire, and the entire history. Chicago is a good example. And again, for many of them, I have 3, 4, 5, 6 fires, Moscow, anywhere you want. So once you have electricity, the whole world changes, because the volume of light is dramatic. Suddenly, we're not that dark. Being outside is not that dangerous. Being indoors is much safer. You don't need fire. And this in itself is a very interesting event of how electricity overtook the world. I wish I had had more time for this, but I don't, so I'll just run along. A word about Paris, the city of lights. So Paris became the city of lights when its first modern police chief decided to install lamps outdoors. It was the first city in the world that had outdoor lighting, and with it, it got the name City of Lights, but with it, it also became safer, and people started venturing outdoors. There's a lot of history, a lot of law relating to how people started venturing outside. If you go back to Shakespearean times, all of Shakespeare's plays were shown during daytime. People were supposed to be home after curfew. So you think about theater as something you do at night. In Shakespeare's time, you wouldn't be out after dark. So, you know, this was a daytime activity. Night started usually with a curfew bell or cannon. And to make it very, very quickly, you have history of these bells and cannons everywhere. The word curfew comes from the French to curb the fire. And basically, once this bell rang before sunset, you were supposed to turn off all the fires outdoor, go home, light your fire, make babies, eat, dream, maybe mend some socks, but that was basically it. There's a lot of also paraphernalia of how to turn off the fire and all of that thing. Nowadays, when we talk about curfew, we talk about emergency curfews. Unfortunately, they've become very, very frequent. One of the issues which I would essentially beg you for help with is this. I know for a fact that everywhere in the world there was curfew. If you look at, you know, China or France or Germany or anywhere you look at, there was curfew, but there's not one single book that I know of that documents systematically life under curfew. There's lots of mentions, there's lots of hints in operas, stories in plays, people knew what to do when the gun went off. But again, I don't have a full documentation of life under curfew because this was not an emergency curfew, this was a daily curfew. Curfews occur regularly, unfortunately in recent years, very, very often, but usually for a very short period and under very extreme emergency measures. So Hollande ordered France, French cities put under curfew during the terrorist attacks. I don't want to go into more current events, but I think you pretty much get this picture. Now, curfew too has become a political issue because, especially in America, curfew is directed towards or against juveniles. Basically, in many American cities, if you are under the age of 18, basically, sometimes the ages vary, you can expect to be stopped by a police officer. And if you don't have a good reason why you are outdoors, you will be arrested. They actually arrest hundreds of thousands of children. Don't be surprised to find these are sort of disproportionately children of minorities. But again, this is a pretty standard thing with very heavy penalties. So nowadays, curfews are mandated or directed towards specific parts. But again, curfew and loitering, lots of offenses that deal with people being outside when they shouldn't be. Again, I'm giving you a snippet. This is something that happens to date in most American cities, including places where you wouldn't really expect that. And that makes life very, very uncomfortable. We're talking about millions of teenagers being arrested just for being outside at night without good reason. Okay.
3 minutes, please.
Sorry?
3 minutes, yes.
Okay, so I'll go very, very quickly from history to one more big legal issue, which I really want to go into, and then I'll sort of stop, is the issue of thievery at night. There is, so two things sort of quickly. One is there is a lot of law up to date that makes offenses at night considered a lot more severe. The extreme version of it, which exists in Jewish law, historic Jewish law, Roman historic law, but also in English law up to the 17th, maybe 18th century, is this. If a thief was caught at night, he could be killed, whether he was a danger or not. He could be executed by a person who met him. So there was no requirement of him being dangerous or anything like this. This was a very clear way to tell thieves, do not operate at night. Why? Because night was very, very dangerous in an era where it was very, very dark. People were afraid and hiding in their houses. So again, I can show you biblical mentions to American codes, contemporary code. Last word, a Dutch code and so on. Maybe I was optimistic about my time. Let me say one final word. There's a lot of things still banned at night. Given that in the big cities, we all share spaces together, we cohabitate. I'm giving you the Israeli regulation, but basically night, meaning anything between 6:30 or 9 or 11 or 12, you cannot make noise. There are a lot of laws of nuisances, there are a lot of things you cannot do at night. Now we have a firework issue in some cities in America, in New York specifically. This is an issue that is now nuisances. There's lots of things you cannot do today, even in your own home at night. And this is just a really quick example. I was giving the Israeli example because, like Chrystel mentioned, in Israel, the regulation of nuisances defines night differently in every single regulation for no clear reason. Sometimes it's 6 p.m., 10 p.m., 11 p.m. for different noises. So if you want to have a party, that's 10 p.m. If you want to run your washing machine, that's a different hour. Life is really weird when you're the Israeli regulator. Contemporary issues also include night work, which again is a socioeconomic issue. Who needs to work at night to pay for themselves? Especially think about 24-hour supermarkets. Think about the resistance of European cities to night work. There's lots of reasons behind that, lots of regulation. And again, I can give you a lot of international laws about this, the International Labour Organization level to the European level to basically every country. So to make it really, really short, what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to entice more lawyers to look into the specific regulation of law or legal regulation at night. And I would be very, very happy if any one of you would send me afterwards in any way you can information that you sort of see relevant, or if you need my assistance, I'd be happy to work to help you. Thank you very much, and I apologize for taking too much time.
Welcome. Thank you. An amazing presentation, very interesting. It's a different perspective, right?
And I apologize for that as well.
Thank you very much, guy. And now it's time for Nándor. Are you here, Nándor?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
I'm just making the screen sharing.
Mm-hmm.
I need to. Okay, so you can see my first slide, right? Okay. So if it's okay and you can hear me, then I could start it.
Perfect.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to make my presentation here at this conference. Nándor Petrovics from Corvinus University of Budapest. My background is in a very short introduction for myself. My background is political science, public economics, and public policy and management. So please see my presentation from this perspective. Maybe I have some kind of a different background than some of you. So my presentation will be about governance in nighttime economies, a network perspective. The aim of this presentation is to show a possible interpretation through a theoretical approach on how we can see and might try to understand what is happening in the governance in nighttime economies. And my main idea is that the concept of governance networks could be an adequate approach for studying policymaking in nighttime economies. And of course, I'm not claiming that there are no other concepts or approaches which are possible. This is a theoretical presentation, so I would give some examples, but it's mainly theoretical. But this presentation or this work which I will present is part of a doctoral research project on governance networks in European nighttime economies at Corvinus University of Budapest, Hungary. And actually you can see Budapest in my screen. And it's very interesting for me, and I really look forward to your comments, because this is the first time when this whole idea is presented in front of nighttime researchers and professionals. If I would like to locate the topic in the existing literature, I would say that there are some different fields of studies which can be related to these issues. On the one hand, there is literature on nighttime economy and urban policy and urban planning and development. Also, some authors discusses policy problems and measures in nighttime economies. And on the other hand, there is a literature on governance networks, and especially governance networks in urban governance. But this governance network approach is not meaning some kind of a social network analysis, but it's rather a discursive approach. So it is rather can be related to the field of political science, public policy and management. What I observed in the literature, maybe I'm not correct, but what I observed that in the recent literature, network perspective is less elaborated in connection with the governance of nighttime economies. However, several authors mention networks when they are talking about nighttime economies. So what is the concept which I would like to apply? The starting point of the whole concept is that there is a group of, or a set of actors in the empirical reality who are mutually dependent. I will talk about dependencies later, but they are operationally autonomous. And there is a public policy problem or a set of problems in the center of this network. And these problems have an impact on actors, and therefore these problems are aimed to be solved by the actors. And the mutual dependency of the actors is the result of the situation that the resources which are needed for solving the problems are distributed among actors. And therefore, actors have to combine their resources in order to solve their common problems. And this combination of resources requires a cooperation, and in order to have a cooperation, actors start a series of interactions like discourses, negotiations, power games, which series of interaction results stable patterns of social relations, which leads to a relatively institutionalized self-regulative framework, which can be understood as a network. Of course, there should be some kind of a starting point when we try to define the field, the empirical field. When I was trying to find some contours of the nighttime economy, it was not so easy. I already mentioned the time perspective. So of course there is a possibility to define the night from the perspective of time, but there is also an opportunity to define the time in terms of space, because it's concentrated in distinct places of the cities. We can have a contour in terms of activities and services like leisure activities, cultural, social activities, and related services. What is very interesting for me, and I'm still, discovering this type of perspective, defining the night in terms of quality or nature. It is not easy to grasp, especially for me, because I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a philosophist, I'm rather, dealing with some kind of other stuff. So it's not easy to grasp for me, but somehow it appears that nighttime is somehow less regulated, less planned, less controlled than daytime. So there can be an opposition. And night is a specific atmosphere for human activities, which provides on one hand an enabling environment for self-expression and socialization. But on the other hand, there are contested norms, and the allowance of rule breaking could lead to problems. So which are these problems? I will not read it, because I think all of us, we are aware of these problems: infrastructural problems, criminal problems, long-term effects like touristification, gentrification, the problems of public space, public health, and the deeper problems of contesting cultures, identities, and self-expression. But my argument is at this point that it is a complex multi-component issue. It is a set of problems which could be considered as a policy syndrome of nighttime economies, which appears more or less in a similar way, at least in its components and its causality, in different empirical contexts. So this is one claim from my side. There are, of course, actors in nighttime economies. I just outlined some of them, like the venues itself, but the local residents, the tourists, the nighttime workers, or the group of these kind of people, and as well the different levels of governments, and of course the public service organizations and law enforcement agencies, as of course there could be several others actors. My second claim is that these actors share considerable similarities in different empirical contexts, at least in terms of their composition. So in every cities we can find like local government, we can find nighttime workers and so on. The third issue is the resources, because we have talked about resources. These actors have different resources, and these resources are distributed among actors. For example, actors can have financial resources like public or private investment, subsidies, physical resources like materials, personal, immaterial rights. They can have authority like decision-making competencies, implementation competencies. Of course, they have there are different types of knowledge and information, and they can provide also legitimacy like political support or something for actions for policy making. Of course, one type of resources is not limited to one type of actors, but typical actors could have typical resources in different empirical contexts. For example, maybe the actors of the public realm could have the authority for making decisions or for implement policies. Now the question is, how could we link actors, problems, and resources together? First, the first question is, what do these actors have in common in nighttime economies? My argument is that in the first place, they have their problems in common, because the problems described above more or less affect all the actors, not necessarily all the components of the problems, but basically they are aware of the same problems. So through these problems, the actors can be seen as interrelated to each other because they share the same problems or similar problems. Second point, that the resources which are required for dealing with the problems are distributed among actors. And because of the distribution of the resources, the actors can be seen as interdependent on each other because they have to combine their resources if they want to deal with their common problems. So these are the 2 points what the actors have in common: the problems and the resources, and because of this, they are interrelated and interdependent. Now, here's the first point of the interpretation. My claim is that these actors could be interpreted as a nighttime ecosystem. Of course, that ecosystem is a widely used term, and we use the term of ecosystem in several perspectives. So this is just one perspective, but we maybe can say that actors are in a nighttime ecosystem, which can be seen as a rather broad or loose set of actors who are not necessarily have a cooperation yet, but they are already have a precondition of the cooperation, the interrelated and interdependent position. Here is a very primitive figure of that. What we see in these nighttime ecosystems, actually, the literature suggests, but we can see actually in the field, that these actors of nighttime economies are not independently operating, but they are somehow more or less related to each other, somehow they are interacting with each other. The other point is that, in addition, there is a certain dynamics and interaction among actors which could be observed within the nighttime economics. At least we can see specific actors and their activities around the world to try to facilitate the interaction and cooperation between actors in nighttime ecosystems. And these are the actors who we call as night mayors or night ambassadors. Now, I tried to match the concept of governance networks with the things we can see in nighttime economies. First, we have the policy problem or a set of problems, which, as I discussed, can be seen as a policy syndrome of nighttime economies. Second, we need to have a set of mutually dependent but autonomous actors and their distributed resources. I think we have these actors because, as I said, that there are identifiable actors and identifiable resources, and these actors and resources can be interpreted as a part of a nighttime ecosystem. What we also see that there is a series of interactions resulting in relatively stable social relations between actors. So not just the literature suggests, but we also can observe that the actors maintain interactions like cooperation, negotiation, power games, etc. Between each other, and we can see the appearance of the network manager organizations like night mayors, night ambassadors. And my claim is that governance networks seem to be emerged from the nighttime ecosystems of cities, and here is a very simple figure of that. You can see the different actors, and you can see the loose boundaries of governance networks. There's a stronger cooperation between actors, which can be seen as a network, and we can find a network manager organization. I've already talked about it, but I would say one remark about specifically the night mayors and night ambassadors as night manager organizations. The position, role, and activities has been already investigated by recent articles, and we are very lucky because the authors are sitting actually here in this sessions. For example, Andreina, Seijas, and Mariko says that the night mayors can be seen as a new platform through which problems of nighttime economy can be handled in a participatory and proactive way. My argument is that it can be not only as a platform, but we can see it as network managers. We can see these organizations as network managers as well. Now, my recommendation is that maybe we can use the network approach to have a broader perspective and take a look at the networks that these network managers manage. It is just a short explanation. I will not read it about the possible alternative explanations that maybe it is just one concept, the network, the concept of the network, but because we know that we have here hierarchies and markets. I just leave it here and leave it to think about which one would be the most feasible explanation about the structure within which the actors cooperate, about the position and the relations between the actors, about the coordination mechanisms within which the actors try to solve problems, and about the motivation of the actors to cooperate. So my last two slides is about the future perspectives, both practical and scientific. These are just, long-term recommendations about maybe, okay, thank you. Maybe what we can see, we can investigate in the future. Using this discursive network perspective could provide us a better understanding of the interactions, discourse, and dynamics between actors based on their perceptions, because the interactions are based on in this theory, in this approach. The interactions are based on the perceptions of the actors, so we can understand that these perceptions, we can understand why do they say and do what do they say, what they say and do. It is very important, I think, understand the motivation, the ideas behind the actions. We can have some practical management tools for night mayors or night ambassadors for managing their networks, like conflict resolution and so on. We can build longer-term comparisons, mutually accepted outcomes, and more enduring solutions. We can increase the inclusiveness, effectiveness, and accountability of the governance in nighttime economies. We can have good opportunities for cross-case comparisons, because of the supposed similarity of policy syndromes, actors, and resources. Of course, we can investigate the different types of networks or different modes of network governance. And what is the most general idea of the future perspective is that we can extend the widely used approach of the governance networks, which is a very widely used approach in the field of public policy management. We can extend this approach to a new empirical field, which is the nighttime economy. Thank you very much for your listening, and I'm very happy to answer any questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nándor. Very interesting. Yeah. So there's a difficult issue, you know, the nightlife governance. So now it's time for Christian Morgner. Are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, your time.
Okay, super. Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. Hope you're all safe, so if you know, in these strange times. So in my presentation, I'm going to talk about culture policies and nighttime economies in Tokyo, Japan, and Berlin, Germany. The research that underpins this presentation is in collaboration with my colleague, Mariko Ikeda from the University of Tsukuba in Japan. I believe Mariko is also present, but I will basically run through this presentation, our research, because it's now 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. in Tokyo, so it seemed a bit unfair, so you know, to involve her in this presentation. The research for this presentation, I have to say, is supported by a grant from the Japanese Society for the Promotion of Science. So the research we're going to present is some of the early findings, but we will, so you know, over the next years, continue our research. It's a comparative study of nighttime economies in Berlin, Amsterdam, London, and Paris. And then also recently, we have been quite fortunate in securing another pump priming grant to do some research on the impact of COVID-19 on nighttime economies in London, Berlin, and Tokyo. So in today's presentation, I will focus basically on 2 issues. So what are these issues? So the first one is that is a conceptual issue that a lot of the current research on nighttime economies, in particular in metropolitan areas, works very much with the global cities approach, you know, that derives from Saskia Sassen's publication on the global city. And the sort of, you know, impact or limitation of this approach is that first and foremost, comparisons then tend to focus on the most obvious candidates. So you see a lot of comparative research, for instance, on nighttime economies like New York and London, or London and Tokyo, etc. But you find very little research that looks sort of, you know, more at global cities that are of that global track. Secondly, then also a lot of these comparisons tend to approach the development and structure of nighttime economies within a very economical theoretical framework. Secondly, although sort of, you know, nighttime economies sit within the broader cultural economy, it's quite interesting to us that there is no framework. So of the previous presentation, in a way, like refer to this, that there is no framework that considers culture meaning making in shaping these policies in nighttime economies. So these are the 2 issues that we would like to address, and I'll talk about some of the early findings in today's presentation. The theoretical framework for this one is based on a book that I've published recently, where we sort of, you know, propose the idea of a relational model of culture. And the idea is here to see culture in 2 dimensions. So first and foremost, to see culture as an object, as is, you know, typically studied in, I don't know, for instance, sociology of culture, where you look at the concentration of music venues, the development of administrative structure of culture policies, and so forth. But then the other issue then, what we also want to promote, is to consider culture much more as a conceptual resource. For instance, to look at the impact of culture meanings in the formation of policy frameworks or models of urban planning. We've collected quite a bit of data. So the data derives from a range of in-depth interviews with professionals, policymakers. We've looked at a sizable number of historical policy documents, policy briefs, etc. We've also collected some statistical evidence, done some quantitative mapping, etc. And then finally, we've also done a visual analysis of photographs. So I start with our findings on Tokyo. So the rise of Tokyo's nighttime economy in the 1920s is very much related to Tokyo's rise as a global economic power at that time. Yeah, so these two issues are interlinked. And with this rise to global economic power, we see some new phenomenon that appear in Tokyo and Japan for the first time. So for instance, for the first time, Japan is developing a middle class, the so-called white collar workers appearing, dubbed often as the so-called salaryman. So it's the picture of these gentlemen sitting in the middle. So there's a new type of consumption developing. We also see the rise of a whole infrastructure around nighttime industries and around cinemas, dance halls, jazz venues, etc. Also interestingly, we see that the word culture, bunkateki, is now being retransformed or rephrased. Before, it was much more related or limited to a traditional understanding in terms of arts and culture. But now the term is broadened and is now encapsulating activities from nighttime consumption to even soap and a range of culture products. What we also find is that it's the time of enormous growth of Tokyo itself. Yeah, so when you look at the charts of the size of the city is nearly tripling from about more than 1 million to nearly 4 million people within a short time frame. So it's covered by a very vast area, and it's within this vast metropolises we find the development of a global atmosphere. So when you look at the picture in the down right corner, and there's a gentleman sitting in the middle, that's Charlie Chaplin. So there was also a lot of international people that were attracted by this international nighttime economy. There's however a second development that also appeared in the interwar period, which is the rise of nationalism and fascism in Japan. And interestingly, culture and creative industries became also involved in that development. Yeah, so a lot of artists and creatives that worked in the nighttime economy became part of the war effort, was employed in a way to design these posters, were designs to design the right fashion, etc. So in terms of filmmaking, but even as part of the occupations, they were part of a kind of wider cultural propaganda. Those artists and those creatives that worked in the nighttime economy that didn't want to be part of that development used an interesting survival strategy. They used the size of, the vast size of Tokyo, and basically went into hiding. And when I say hiding, they really literally went into underground spaces, hidden spaces, etc. So a large part of Tokyo's nighttime economy survived the rise of fashionism by going into hiding. This involvement between politics and culture had a really important impact on the post-war nighttime economy, the post-war cultural policies that we find in this area. And I want to talk basically about two main developments about Japan's post-war cultural policies. So one is that the intersection between culture and politics meant that culture almost become like a dirty word. Yeah? So culture was something that with which politics shouldn't interfere, or with Japan shouldn't in a way promote its own culture anymore. So with this rise of the economy in the 1960s, there were deliberate attempts within the Chinese government to prevent that products being produced in Japan would be associated with Japanese culture. Yeah, so because there was this feeling that if that is being done, then it could harm the export of these products into other Asian countries. So the only types of culture that were therefore deliberately supported by the Japanese post-war government were anything from before the 20th century, flower arrangement that you see here, the traditional kabuki theater, and then also tea ceremonies. And they were quite strictly regulated under the newly formed Culture Office of Affairs. So also, other culture activities were pretty much left on their own. There is, however, another really interesting policy development, which is again also related to the experience of World War I, which is called the famous sort of, Fusoku laws, which sort of, basically had this idea that the Japanese government believed that nighttime economies were part of the rise of nationalism, in the sense that in sort of, the night, certain undecent or uncivil behaviors development that had kind of impact on the particular younger people. Yeah, so therefore, sort of, there was this feeling after World War II that some restrictions also need to be made in this area. And that had an interesting impact that you couldn't, until very recently, it was not allowed to drink and dance at the same time in clubs in Tokyo. Interestingly, although this sort of, strict law was introduced after World War II, really, it didn't sort of, mean that there was no dancing and there was no drinking anymore. That would basically kill off Tokyo's nighttime economy, but it would really sort of just mean that it would push Japan's or Tokyo's nighttime economy further into hiding. In the 1990s, the situation changed quite dramatically, and that was basically at the end of the 1980s, Japan's so-called bubble economy burst. So there was a major sort of, downturn in the economic development, and the Japanese government was scrambling sort of, to find a new solution how it can promote Japan's economy. And by that time, sort of, people in Japan thought, sort of, leaned on the development of cool Britannia, yeah, so certain developments that you find here in the UK or sort of, in Australia, while they felt the kind of, quirkiness that is often associated with Japanese culture could actually now be utilized in order to promote the Japanese economy abroad. Yeah, so it was mainly sort of, a marketing strategy for the export of products from Japan into other parts of the world. During that period, the Japanese government, or also in particular Tokyo, began to discover the nighttime economy as a further source to generate income. But quite interestingly, this approach to the nighttime economy is quite a limited approach in a certain sense, because it mainly looks at the nighttime economy from the perspective of tourism. Yeah, so when you look sort of, at some of these promotional links, I know you're more than happy sort of, to look at this video later on. You see sort of, that there are now all these, activities from, kayaking during the night, guided tours during the night to explore like pubs and venues, etc. Theater tours during the night, etc. So all of this, but all of this sort of, is within a policy framework that is mainly in order to attract tourism from abroad into Tokyo. The struggle somewhat remains. Yeah, so the challenge I talked about earlier on has not been affected by all these measures and by all these developments. Tokyo's nighttime economy still remains very large to be an underground or hidden economy. So when you look at some of the satisfaction surveys that are submitted by the tourists, the majority in a way like complains that they find it so hard to navigate Tokyo's nighttime economy that it seems to so inaccessible. Yeah, something that is really only known to insiders or kind of people that frequent this nighttime economy. In the second part, I would like to talk about our findings from Berlin. So the big development or rise of Berlin's nighttime economy, again, also in the 1920s, is very much in opposition or very much in contrast to Tokyo. Yeah, so we heard, Tokyo's nighttime economy is developing in relation to its post-war rise, whereas in Berlin or in Germany, it's almost the other way around. After World War II, Germany finds itself in a situation of a political instability. There's hyperinflation here, so the country is almost falling apart. But interestingly, this falling apart, this lack of social cohesion is actually what is necessary or what is driving the formation of Berlin's nighttime economy. So I think you have to imagine that Germany by the time was still very much a conservative country, very highly regulated, etc. And so this kind of loss of this conservatism, this loss of these traditional values was something that was exploited by cultural entrepreneurs and by people that wanted to have a much freer lifestyle. Also interestingly, the hyperinflation was responsible that people would rather spend their income and rather spend their money instead of waste it and in their bank accounts. So when you look at some statistical data in this sphere, you can see sort of, you know, that the 1920s were the period where you find a rise in the creation of establishments selling alcohol, restaurants, bars. You also find the rise in terms of cinemas, theaters, and, you know, other sort of, you know, venues. So sort of, you know, quite a sort of, you know, strong impact. Thank you. Interestingly, there's a similar development in Germany that its nighttime economy, its culture and arts also becomes parts of, you know, of the cultural propaganda, part of fascism, etc. You see this, you know, in particular with the cinema. That's the only economy that's not in decline, but because it was, you know, integrated into this culture propaganda, and that has a major impact on the post-war development of Berlin. So it had an impact on the post-war development in two aspects. So very often, you know, when we think about the divided Berlin, we think about the division in terms of that the Western part was so different from the Eastern part. But I think in our research, we want to advance the idea that although there is a difference between the two areas, what differentiates them even more so is from the rest of Germany. And if you sort of, you know, look at this comparative perspective, we can actually see much more similarities between the two Berlins than, you know, with their sort of, you know, wider sort of, you know, national territories. So therefore, sort of, we actually said that Berlin needs to be considered a special place. So what does it mean in terms of cultural policies? So in West Berlin, it was a place that was very unpopular to live. Most of the economies sort of, you know, had vacated Western Berlin. The middle class sort of, you know, had moved to the Western part. So pretty much it was kind of like an empty city with an old housing stock. Well, that proved to be quite a decisive area for all sorts of creatives and sort of, you know, night owls in a way to populate and move on to Berlin. There's kind of social ignorance. This is where this kind of culture could flourish. So you see sort of, you know, Nick Cave sort of, you know, being interested in that one and move therefore for West Berlin. So the kind of social ignorance was really important. Whereas in West Berlin, in East Berlin, it was almost like the opposite, that the East German government had all these cultural policies about, you know, making East Germany this great sort of, you know, window of like socialism to the world, etc. And as part of that, they invested heavily into its culture infrastructure, you know, into the theaters and museums and all of that. And almost like as a obviously, you know, unplanned consequence, it made East Berlin a major hub for culture at nighttime activities that then, due to the size sort of, you know, of its culture scene and the size of the city, then could also, you know, go into hiding and, you know, develop all these activities that were then beyond the control of the East German government. Yeah, so like, and therefore sort of, you know, before the unification, you had a very sizable and very sort of, you know, lively nighttime economy in both parts. And then with the unification, this sort of, you know, situation then changes. Suddenly in the middle of the city where the, you know, Berlin Wall used to be, all these empty spaces are suddenly open up. And suddenly sort of, you know, the hidden communities that lived on both sides started to occupy these places. And as you might know, techno was a really important musical influence in occupying these spaces and sort of, you know, providing an experience in uniting these people. Yeah, and as a kind of result to this, you know, Berlin almost appeared as a kind of, you know, religious place. Yeah, there was this motto being Berlin being poor but sexy. Yeah, and out of this sort of, you know, in a way, Berlin's nighttime economy developed. Yeah, as a very specialized nighttime economy based on these experiential places. Yeah, a lot of the nighttime economies you will see are based in former prisons and former bunkers and former libraries, etc. So this is sort of, you know, now part of the tourism and the experience of Berlin's nighttime economy. So coming to an end. So therefore, based on our framework, you can see that although there are two really distinct cities, they share similar cultural policies and infrastructure. Also, we found it quite interestingly, although sort of, you know, we only recently talk about nighttime economies, they have a very long cultural history. And also, sort of, you know, we feel that understanding nighttime economies requires such an interdisciplinary framework at this sort of, you know, intersection of cultural geography, cultural sociology, and cultural history. Thank you very much.
Thank you. An amazing comparison between Berlin and Tokyo, right? And
yes, thank you.
Yeah. Wow, very amazing. So now it's time for Andreina. Are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, your time.
Just shared my screen.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Good. So hello, everyone. I'm happy to be part of this space, though virtual space nowadays. Today, I'm going to talk to you about a presentation titled Nocturnal Heritage, Awakening the Historic Quarter of Valparaíso in Chile. This research is part of consulting project that I did with the Inter-American Development Bank. I've been working with the Inter-American Development Bank in several cities in Latin America, trying to think about how the night can be seen as a more proactive space, as a space of opportunity rather than a space of fear in a region as complex as Latin America. And I will tell you more about this. And this is also research linked to my doctoral studies here at Harvard University and connected more to the topic of nighttime governance and planning. This presentation is more from the perspective of urban planning and how urban planning and other design disciplines should be more focused on looking at the city at night. And important to mention is that roughly 1/3 of 142 World Heritage Sites in Latin America are in historic city centers. And this is important to know because in the absence of policies to govern what happens at night, what happens after 6 p.m., most of these city centers in Latin America become ghost towns. And so this presentation will focus on the region of Latin America and the Caribbean and how the rise of the urban night as a field of study and practice has happened along studies and along research to protect its cultural heritage. And however, I think it's important to first clarify what the structure of the presentation will be. So first I will define what is nocturnal heritage. Second, I will talk about this concept of nocturnalization of Latin America. Third, I'll talk about the night and specifically the historic quarter of Valparaíso in Chile. And finally, I will end with some considerations for nighttime governance in times of social distancing, because I think, as Will brilliantly mentioned this earlier today in his presentation, it's very difficult for all of us to distance ourselves from what's happening as a result of COVID-19, and nighttime governance is very impacted by this current crisis. To begin with the notion of nocturnal heritage, I would like to talk briefly about what's the definition of heritage and how it has affected this concept. So the definition of cultural heritage is the legacy of a physical artifact and intangible attributes of a group or society that is inherited from past generations. The notion of nocturnal heritage thus refers to the tangible and intangible elements that depict or are associated to a place's nocturnal history. From a spatial perspective, as I mentioned before, so most World Heritage Sites in Latin America are located in central areas, in historic city centers. And this, you will see later on, it's very important when we think about the night and when we think about nocturnal heritage, because it tends to bring us back to the city center at night, which is a place that became abandoned in many Latin American cities as a result of the expansion of these cities and the emergence of new centralities. So when we think about heritage, it's probably the last thing that comes to mind is the night and the existence of other areas beyond these centralities, such as red light districts. And cities like Amsterdam, Antwerp, Shanghai, Hong Kong, all have special neighborhoods that cluster some of these services, sex-oriented businesses, such as strip clubs, sex shops, and adult theaters. And these practices, it's important to note that they're also an important part of a city's nocturnal history and heritage, but however, they haven't been studied from the perspective of urban planning and design. I'm going to take a step back now and think about the notion of heritage and how it will connect to all of these topics related to the night. And it's important that when we think about heritage, many things come into mind. And there's the concept of the nighttime economy, which we can discuss later on. It has come up throughout the presentations in this panel. And the nighttime economy, one of the issues with this term is that on one hand, it's a widely used term, but there's not a clear definition of that term, not only in terms of the activities that it encompasses, but also in terms of the timeframes. The concept of urban revitalization, and finally, creative industries, or the orange economy as it's come to be known in Latin America. But we think about these three concepts when we think about heritage, or when we think about urban revitalization in city centers in Latin America, and there's a risk of focusing on these concepts in a vacuum and overlooking the existing dynamics and the different people that belong in these areas, and that are at a central part of nocturnal identity. And this connects to issues such as that have come also throughout the presentations today, gentrification and the idea around heritagization or patrimonialization or UNESCO site, and how these World Heritage sites sometimes forget to look into, they talk about the memories and the identities and protecting a place without even considering all the elements and all the actors involved in that place. There's a very important aspect of understanding nighttime heritage is understanding how it's governed. And here I interject the aspect of nocturnal governance because this is the main topic of our panel. And for me, the definition of nighttime governance always looks at three main elements. And I always talk about these three because I believe that it's important to look at the hardware and software. This is two terms that I borrowed from former mayor of Bogota, Antanas Mocus, who used to talk about the city as having hardware or infrastructure, software, and regulations. And then the third element is the institutions, like Nándor was talking before, the network, the intricate network of actors that range from the government to other kinds of actors in the private sector, as well as all kinds of organizations, civil society organizations, and other independent actors. So by looking at these three elements, we can talk about governance instead of government of the night. And it's important to connect, to have this notion, the clarity about this concept when we talk about heritage, particularly at night. And this concept of nighttime governance is at the heart of the research that I've been doing here at Harvard, and was at the heart of the paper that I produced and in collaboration with Mariko Milan, and we published earlier this year. And the goal of this study and the goal of this work was to raise awareness of this growing network of actors, whether they're called night mayors, night czars, night ambassadors, nighttime advocacy organizations around the world, and how they've been growing over the past 15 years. And you can see in this map, which is part of the study, how they can be located inside or outside government. And we will see later in the presentation how their situation often determines the resources and the impact they have in their communities where they operate. Let me just start getting closer to Valparaíso and talk about the nocturnalization of Latin America. And by nocturnalization, I'm borrowing a term from Craig Kozlowski from his work from 2011, where he defines his book, Evening's Empire, which is great and I recommend. He uses the term to refer to the expansion of social and symbolic uses of the night, which took place largely between the 16th and 19th century. And I'm borrowing this term to talk about the expansion of the use and appropriation of the night in a region like Latin America. It's important to take a step back and look at the 1990s. And the 1990s were a particularly dark time in the whole sense of the word for many cities in Latin America. And this is a picture of Bogota in Colombia. And Bogota in the 1990s the country had record high levels of violence. Someone died someone was killed violently every 24 minutes. And the night, this image and this memories from the 1990s created a very strong stigma around the night in Latin America. And the night seems a space of fear and as a space that had to be restricted and over-regulated. And it was during this time in the 1990s, in 1995 to be more precise, when Bogota and former Mayor Antanas Mocus enacted this curfew called the carrot law, la ley zanahoria. Carrot because something zanahoria or something like carrot in Colombian culture refers to something that's not cool. So the ley zanahoria basically said that everything had to close, everything related to nightlife and alcohol consumption had to close at 1 a.m. And the goal behind this policy was was basically the premise that by restricting nighttime activity, you could reduce the violence and the crime and all the negative externalities associated to nighttime activity. And this curfew was very influential throughout Latin America. Not only in Bogota, it lasted many years, it was replicated by many cities throughout Colombia, and also Panama City had a similar curfew, Asunción, Paraguay had a similar curfew. And we'll see how that propagated this stigma and this perception of the night as a space that has to be limited and a space associated to fear. But in the early 2000s, this began to change. And the reason why it began to change was thanks to events and festivals such as Nuit Blanche and the Nights of the Museums, which became very, very popular in Latin America. And you can see here in this little map how they expanded, particularly in South America, to many of the region's capitals, and even to Caracas, Venezuela, my hometown, where Caracas, as you know, it's one of the most dangerous cities in the world. And we even had the opportunity to walk in the middle of the street to have a similar Nuit Blanche festival. It started in 2006. And by the way, that's the event that got me started into working in this field. But it's interesting to see how these particular events that linked the idea of culture and well-being and happiness and interaction and the night started to change and to reshape gradually the perception of the night in Latin America. So the night became to be little by little more understood as a space for socialization, as like a unique space for the youth and for women to meet each other, particularly in spaces that are highly polarized or highly violent. And in more recent years, this has been escalating very, very rapidly. And in more recent years, these are pictures from Asunción, Paraguay. Cities like Asunción have been able to articulate the role of the private sector. So the owners of bars and restaurants of an area such as the city center, which is the one in the pictures, came together and are working with the municipality to revitalize the city center at night. So we can see how gradually the region has been embracing the idea of the night from a more positive perspective, and the appropriation of space by people of different ages and different backgrounds at night. And in 2016, the first city in Latin America to appoint a night mayor, create a night mayor role, was Cali in Colombia, where they created the night manager role. And you can see in the picture how Merrick Milan, then night mayor of Amsterdam, came to Cali along with me and other people from different cities around the world to help Cali think about what this role meant. And this was a time when Cali, which is one of the capitals of dance and music in Colombia, was trying to reinvent the way they use their spaces at night. But let me get into Valparaíso. And it's very important for me to share because I have a very long connection with this city. It's a beautiful city in Chile that I started working in thanks to the Inter-American Development Bank. And I quickly realized how there's so many interesting places in South America that we don't talk about that much, but that connect so many of these aspects and that make us realize the importance of the night for many different groups in the city. And Valparaíso, for those who don't know about this city, is a small coastal city in Chile that was once the most important port in the Pacific. This wasn't the most important port until the Panama Canal was created, because until then the ships had to go all the way south and then come all the way back up if they were going to California, for instance. And in 2003, it was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And its historic city center was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And however, the port and the city have been deteriorating faster and faster since. And one of the factors for this deterioration is that the port became automated, and that the rise of other tourist destinations in the area, such as Viña del Mar, which is a neighboring city. While Valparaíso still remains a beautiful and picturesque city, crime and violence have been rising over the past 10 years, and the city faces many structural challenges. And it was in this context that I was invited by the Inter-American Development Bank to think about the city at night, to think about its World Heritage Site, to try to protect the site, but to think about it from a nocturnal perspective. And when we think about the challenges, the infrastructural challenges that a city like Valparaíso has, we have to think about its topography. So it's a city with very high, steep hills, staircases. They have these funiculars, these elevators, like the picture in the middle, you can see there, that people use to climb to the up in the hills. And they have these very narrow corridors that are covered with street art. Valparaíso is one of the capitals of street art around the world, and many people from Europe and from different parts of the world go there to explore these beautiful murals and art forms. But as you can see, it's quite dark. It's quite dark, and also part of these spaces are inhabited during the night. So I was faced with the question of how to reactivate this area at night, how to respect and how to understand its heritage and connect it to the process of revitalizing this area. And the first decision, the first thought that I had in mind was, well, let's ask the people, let's ask its inhabitants what they think about Valparaíso at night. So that's what we did. And we did a series of focus groups and workshops in the style of charrettes. And we did them with all kinds of people. You can see in the picture on the left, young people, people from the skate club, coming to talk about the city. On the top right, you can see older residents. And then on the bottom, you can see people from the municipality and different institutions that operate in the city. And one of the things that they did in this exercises was, I gave them a map and I gave them some tools to try to think about what's to characterize together. What are the challenges and the opportunities of this area, particularly at night? And as I said before, I like to talk about the hardware and the software. So we talked about the lighting, the public spaces, the mobility, the urban furniture. We also talked about the software, such as the regulation, how to moderate and regulate alcohol consumption, issues around noise. And I gave them these tools, and they used with stickers, they helped me identify in the map which areas made them feel differently. So they identified which areas made them feel happy, which areas made them feel neutral or just, normal, and which make them feel uncomfortable. And as you can see in the map, most areas are marked as uncomfortable. And this is a map of the World Heritage Site. So the area that concentrates the highest level of violence and the highest level of the perception of fear is precisely the UNESCO site. And they also marked with little stars, they marked the location of bars and clubs, and you can see that most of them, or many of them, are located there. An important thing that came up was that we had one city and we had three different identities. They were not talking to each other. So we have the port city, as I said, the port is it's automated. And then you have the tourist city, which is like Valparaíso, trying to still be perceived as this wonderful tourist destination. But then you have a university town, a college town, where you have thousands of universities there. What's happening? The port takes part of the waterfront. So the port makes the city a city without a waterfront. So that affects tourists who come to Valparaíso and don't have where to walk. But then tourists, or the great presence of tourists, makes the prices of nightlife and culture and entertainment go so high that then university students cannot pay for those activities. And what ends up happening is that you have thousands of university students having drinks in the stairs that I showed you before, or in the plaza. So you have a collection of situations in which the different vocations or identities of the city, since they're not talking to each other, they're creating a problem. And an important thing is that at the heart of this is the conflict, of course, of the dynamics between tourists and residents. This is not new. We've seen this in so many parts of the world, in Amsterdam, in Lisbon. Jordi has talked a lot about this. And the connection of this with nightlife, and how the disconnection between the strategies to think about the night and the needs of different resident groups, and how we forget some groups like the young people, that just asking them and making them involved in the plan is a very important part of the process. And these residents are not any residents. These are very open-minded residents. They call themselves not hippies, but happies. Valparaíso is a very open-minded city. It's a cultural city, it's a bohemian city. It's very rich with culture and architecture, but still they're having many issues to try to compensate the existence of so many dynamics and so many histories in one place. We also used a spatial analysis as a tool to understand the agglomeration of these activities and to understand how they're located in space. So this was such a hard work. I had to geocode manually all the liquor licenses in the city because this didn't exist. They didn't have a picture of where alcohol was distributed. So you can see in the map, all the purple spots are liquor licenses. And then you can see the idea of this map was to try to understand the distribution of liquor licenses, where they agglomerate, and then how they relate to the density, the population density. So you can see in the city center, I don't know if you can see my arrow here, but this is the city center, the UNESCO site. These are all the purple liquor licenses. As I said, most of the bars are here. This is the area considered the most unsafe in the city, the least safe. And then you can see the city, Valparaíso, is divided in half. So the city center it's a flat area, but then you have the hills, and most people live in the hills. So the browner color, the darker colors, indicate higher residential concentrations. And you can see that, thank God, most of the liquor licenses are not located where most of the residents are. However, you can see that there's not enough provision of fire services, of health services, of public spaces. So it's really interesting to look at the distribution of nighttime activity from a spatial perspective, not only from a temporal one.
1 minute.
And also, yeah, and also I'm about to close. I'm just gonna move forward because I have too much to say. I just wanted to point out that as I said in the beginning, the idea of nocturnal heritage connects to the city's history and the city's foundation. As I said, when Valparaíso used to be the jewel of the Pacific, it had many bars that were the places of entertainment for sailors and for people who came to the port. These places exist today. These bars are from 1886 and 1987 and are part of the strategy that we're trying to do to connect them in space and try to promote the revitalization of the city center at night by preserving its heritage. I don't think I will have time to get into this, but I wanted to just share that I'm working now with another city, which is Tegucigalpa, Honduras. We're working on a plan to revitalize the city center at night. And part of the plan is that we now realize we're not only revitalizing, we're also recovering after COVID. And so we're doing many things. Among them, we launched a survey recently to measure the impact of COVID-19 over people who work in the city center at night. More than 150 people have responded, including freelancers and providers. I might not be able to get into this, but just to close, I wanted to say that the notion of nocturnal heritage requires a more holistic and inclusive definition, that nocturnal governance is a new platform for knowledge sharing and collaboration, that nightlife, culture, and hospitality were already vulnerable and that they're the more affected sectors due to COVID-19, and that the current crisis is an opportunity to rethink the way that leisure and entertainment are distributed in urban areas. And the question is, how can we make room for heritage in this formula? And that's it. Thank you.